Today I have with me about 5 guests, but before I move on, I have to disclaim that the opinions of all our guests are the opinions of the guests alone and not the opinions of the companies or entities that they work with or work for. So first I have with me is Middy Ajayi. He is an oil and gas professional. He's an oil and gas professional with over 15 years of upstream and midstream experience across the United States, Nigeria, Dubai, and the Netherlands. He is currently a global digital business opportunity manager at Royal Dutch Shell. Middy, please go ahead and introduce yourself.
As Lucie said, my name is Middy Ajayi. I think of myself as a petroleum engineer, but really I play any role that I'm given in the oil and gas industry. I started out in this industry about 2006, graduating from the University of Oklahoma. I worked for a few companies in the indigenous local space in Nigeria and Oklahoma, and most recently with Shell, traveling around the world. Happy to be here. I'll cut it short.
Now I have with me as well Middy Ajayi, an LNG and natural gas analyst at an energy analytics firm in London. His educational background is in geology and oil and gas management. Middy, please go ahead and introduce yourself.
Yeah, thanks, Lucie. My name is Middy Ajayi, and I'm currently an LNG analyst at a company here in London, ICIS, Independent Commodity Intelligence Services, whereby we do data analytics, not just on LNG, but on almost all the commodities, including coal, power, electricity, and I sit on the LNG desk looking at oil and gas analysis on a daily basis. As Lucie already said earlier, my background is in geology. Started out like geology from Ife in Nigeria, then with a master's degree in oil and gas management. Before my current role, I was with IHS Markit, looking at West Africa and West Africa energy and political risks for West Africa, for companies operating within the West African region within the oil and gas. So happy to be here and happy to share my thoughts. Thank you.
Next, we have Amayua Charmati. She's a legal officer at the Ghana National Petroleum Commission. Ama, please go ahead and introduce yourself.
Hi, my name is Amayua Charmati. I am a lawyer at Ghana National Petroleum Corporation. I've been there just about 5 years or so. I won't say that my education was really in oil and gas, don't have a master's in oil and gas and anything, but I am a lawyer. I am barred in both Ghana and New York. And I work mainly in the upstream sector. So I am also happy to be here and kind of share with you guys at least my thoughts and opinions on what I've seen in the work that I'm doing and kind of my thoughts moving forward.
Thank you so much, Ama. Next, we have Folarinbola Tiwa. He is a managing director at Ripon Marine Contractors Nigeria Limited, with a background in upstream oil and gas servicing, and has begun working with Macon Incorporation in Houston, Texas in 2001, while working on a degree in marine engineering. Folarin, please go ahead and introduce yourself.
Yeah, good afternoon, everyone. I'm Folarinbola Tiwa, speaking from Lagos, Nigeria here. I'm currently managing director for Ripon Marine Contractors, an upstream oil and gas service provider here in Nigeria. And like it was mentioned earlier, like Lucie mentioned, I started my career in 2001 working for Macon Inc. while I was still in school, pursuing a degree in marine engineering. And after that, I worked for service providers and oil producers alike. Well, my experience since then has been in oil and gas, in the upstream sector of the oil and gas. And I look forward to an interesting evening sharing some of my thoughts and experiences.
Finally, we have with us Yorm Ama Abledu. Yorm is an expert in energy, oil and gas, and holds a postgraduate degree in oil and gas law with international investment arbitration. She is a certified oil and gas contracts negotiator and a law lecturer at the University of Professional Studies in Accra. where she teaches energy law amongst other modules. Yorm, please go ahead and introduce yourself.
Thank you very much, Lucy, for that wonderful introduction. As Lucy mentioned, my name is Yorm Ama Abledu. I'm a lawyer and a law lecturer at the University of Professional Studies in Accra. As a lawyer, I've worked in the energy industry as an oil and gas litigator. So I've done mostly oil and gas litigation and arbitration, and then some work in the power sector as well. All right, I'm happy to be here. Thank you. Thank you for the invitation.
Thank you so much, everyone. So today we will be we'll be discussing two topics. If you remember, if you attended the last seminar with me, the first seminar will have the first topic will hold the crux of the issues that we'll be asking, and the second would be mostly the guests talking about their experiences so far. So today the first topic is on oil and gas and the Rona, a lost battle or a growth of new ideologies. And the first question will be directed at Ama and Yorm. And the first question is, what were the major challenges that were faced during the onset of the coronavirus crisis, and how were some of these challenges discussed and dealt with in your experience? I will start off with Yorm on that question.
All right, Lucy, legally, when we talk about Rona COVID, I think about the effects of COVID on oil and gas contracts. The question we have to ask is whether COVID has had an impact on oil and gas contracts. However, there's been two schools of thoughts on whether COVID can come under the force majeure clause. I'll discuss the school of thoughts. Theoretically, the first school of thought says that there's been a massive reduction in the production of oil and gas, and as such, parties in such circumstances can be discharged based on the fact that COVID is an act of God. I know Amma will disagree with me here, but then the second school of thought states that it's actually the opposite of the first one, whereby COVID cannot be considered as an act of God. It's not made performance of the obligations under the contract impossible, but rather it's a mere hardship. I'll hand over to Amma to speak to us on the reality on the ground.
So, hi everybody. Hello. So I think that discussing kind of the legal issues and the other issues that have come up with respect to COVID in our industry, I think that there have been a lot of conversations. COVID has, affected countries across board, and I think it's important for us to place what is our discussion within a certain context. In Ghana, we know that the government in their budget statement said that IMF estimated that the economy contracted about 3.5% and the global trade was affected hugely. In Ghana, the government said that they had a sudden shortfall in revenue of about 13 billion Ghana cedis. And obviously this was because petroleum receipts were reduced because obviously crude production, crude prices fell immensely. And so looking at the reason for some of these things, we know that obviously basic economics sets supply and demand, and we know that demand fell immensely during this period. I will be kind of limiting my conversation to the upstream where I'm more conversant and I have been dealing with because of kind of my daily work. We saw issues, not just with trying to mitigate the issues that were coming up, but because more generally, we were trying to deal with, so what basically, I'll back up a little and I'll tell you what my work does. So I work basically in the upstream and we are the commercial arm for the government. And so commercially, all the IOCs are essentially our partners, and how were we dealing with our partners to kind of mitigate the issues that were coming up? We saw delays in investments across board. So Tullow delayed FID, not in Ghana, but we saw in their Kenya project, they delayed FID, but we also saw in Ghana that a lot of companies were also suspending their projects and declaring force majeure, one of these being Ake, and on our deep water Channel Cape 3 Points project. We definitely saw suspensions and other suspensions beyond this But we know also that we also saw a country that was being very proactive. The Petroleum Commission, which is our regulator on the upstream, was extremely proactive when this happened. They started having conversations really quickly with the IOCs to determine how they could mitigate these issues. They were saying, you know, come to us and let's have a discussion. Let's talk about the HSE. Let's talk about how both, not just the IOCs, but also the service companies were adhering to their HSE rules, the regulations put out by the Petroleum Commission to make sure that offshore activity was safe and ongoing. One of the biggest things that we've seen that has almost become kind of a buzz term, and you've seen so many law firms write about it, you've seen people discuss it, you've seen it in the news, is the term of force majeure. What is force majeure? And how do we kind of navigate force majeure? I think that has been very interesting. And I think that I'll talk a little more about force majeure because as a lawyer, and I'm sure being on this legal Zoom call, I think that a lot of people kind of know what force majeure is and are kind of interested in how that is going to take shape now moving forward. I think we all are in a lot of respect. I'm going to back up a little and say what force majeure is. I know for the lawyers on there, they're like, really, girl, if that's what you're going to do. But yes, I think that to place it in context for kind of the lawyers that are the non-lawyers on this call, and Yorm can step in whenever she wants as well. So what is force majeure? It allows parties to excuse one party or both parties to excuse performance under a contract, either wholly or partially, because of an occurrence of a delineated event or other events that are out of a party's control. Usually they call these like supervening events. So what supervening event that could not have been anticipated came in to kind of cause parties to not be able to fulfill their obligations under a contract. This is different from what we see with like material change clauses. So material change clauses are clauses that are negotiated and put in contracts that allocate risk with respect to foreseeable events. So this is very different. And we know that force majeure is also not going to be implied in common law jurisdictions because it's a civil law. In civil law, you usually find it in their laws, but not in the common law. And so force majeure becomes very important as a clause in a contract when you're in a common law jurisdiction. And I think most of us are in common law jurisdictions. And so with respect to drafting common law clause, it's so important for lawyers to be putting in the definition of a force majeure clause, the events that constitute force majeure, the effects of a force majeure clause on a contract, that being, should the parties suspend, for how long should they suspend, will this end up after a certain period of time in parties completely terminating a contract? And what does that mean? Because you know that once force majeure is declared and a contract is terminated because of force majeure, then there's no liability for both parties. And so that becomes important. And there are also steps to follow with respect to declaring force majeure. And so if a party also doesn't adhere to the following of those kind of procedures put in place in the contract, that kind of falls away for them as an option as well.
Thank you. Sorry for interrupting you. I just noticed that quite a few people just joined. For those that just joined, we are talking about the major challenges that have been faced in Ama and Yorm's experiences during the onset of the coronavirus, and how are these challenges dealt with? Go ahead and please continue, Ama.
Okay. So basically, I was just kind of putting within the context what we faced in Ghana more specifically and in Africa more generally because of kind of the larger effect of COVID on not just the industry, but the world economy in general. I was talking about force majeure, which has also almost become like a buzzword. And so I was kind of discussing what force majeure has looked like for us because it's something that we have had to grapple with. As a young lawyer, I'm going to say young lawyer, it is important because I think that for most young lawyers, we just kind of looked at a force majeure clause in our review of contracts as a boilerplate term. So we've just kind of seen them in there. We've been like, great, that's in there, so we are good to go. But now it's something that is actually a clause that we need to grapple with and deal with. And you know, and I was saying that force majeure already is not implied in contracts in common law jurisdiction. It actually has to be in a contract for a party to utilize it. So historically, force majeure clauses have also been interpreted quite narrowly. So there was a US court appeals case in 2015 where a Chinese company or the plaintiff tried to declare force majeure because they, under a take or pay sale contract or take or pay service contract, and they were saying that, you know, the Chinese government was flooding the industry or the market with cheap solar panels. And so under their contract, they couldn't fulfill because people were buying those cheap panels instead of buying theirs. And the court said, no, this isn't a reason for you to declare force majeure. Because in most instances, courts also don't want a situation where kind of plaintiffs or people who've entered into contracts use force majeure as a reason to renege on contracts or rescind contracts. So that has become important for us because, you know, we list, usually in a force majeure clause, the clauses are, what causes force majeure is listed, but a good force majeure clause must have like a mop up. And it isn't that, you know, we couldn't place the pandemic within one of these like catch-all terms or catch-all, terms at the end of a force majeure clause. But I think that it also, we stand to see how this kind of works out. More recently, after the SARS, Ebola, MERS, I think that's what it was, epidemics that came up, a lot of people were putting epidemics in force majeure clauses, which you didn't see before. And I think that for countries that weren't affected more directly by these, we weren't including these in our clauses. And so what could a force majeure kind of fall under, even though there were ways in which force majeure could fall under a catch-all. And so we were seeing things like communicable diseases, SARS, epidemics, in contracts. But then more recently in a US,
sorry to interrupt you. You are going to be asking this question again in the next question. So yes, given all the juicy details that will be.
I was just kind of transitioning into the next question. So you can go ahead and ask it and then I'll go on.
I would like to add that, in my opinion, a lot depends on how a contract has defined force majeure actually. If it's invoked by one firm, it will definitely have a ripple effect across the whole sector. And this will definitely open up a legal minefield. And that's what we are seeing on the ground at the moment. Because the key question is whether businesses are directly impacted by the pandemic. Not all indirect effects of the pandemic will be treated as force majeure events, just to add to what Amma said.
Okay, great. That's really awesome. Sorry, the next question is kind of quite similar to the previous question, and I think Amma has really covered most of the first question and most of the second question, the first question, and the second question, sorry, is what recently have we seen as the impacts and effects of the force majeure clause in agreements, especially in the general energy sector? And how, in your opinion, can states learn from this in the future transactions? And what practical approaches have we seen in enabling the clause, especially because the pandemic was quite new for our current century? Again, Amma related back to a few case law on what is actually a latent defect or just an intentional decision to reduce the quality of product, causing force majeure, and therefore not making it necessarily about an act of God. So Amma, as you've added, can you please add a little bit more, and then I will move this question, because you've kind of covered quite a bit, to Dipo and Folarin.
Sure. So, I mean, I know Yorm was talking about, came in to talk about kind of the direct effect of, so there needs to be a causal link between the happening of the force majeure and actually affecting the contract. And I think that that's why Yorm said in the beginning that Ama might disagree with me, because we've had these conversations prior. I was saying that, in a US District Court case more recently, a Southern US District Court case, I believe, in the Southern District of New York, we saw a judge say that force majeure can be considered an act of God because it is such a serious event that it is an act of God. If you look, so these force majeure listed, so these various events that are listed in force majeure are heavily litigated. This isn't the first time that force majeure is actually being dealt with. It is just that the first time we've seen it on such a grand scale. And so I think that we'll have, we can go back even as lawyers to precedent, because in common law jurisdictions, precedent is law, right? And so comes this Southern District New York case that says, no, actually, we are going to, I'm saying that it cannot seriously be disputed that the COVID-19 pandemic is not a natural disaster. And we know that acts of God are considered natural disasters. And when we talk about natural disasters, we are talking about things like tornadoes, floods, things that are an occurrence of nature that can only be attributed to God. And alas, here we are with this judge saying that they are considering, she actually considered force majeure an act of God because it is an event with such a scale that you can consider it a natural disaster. So it'll be interesting to kind of see how that plays out and how that looks like going forward. The fact that a pandemic has occurred already, what happens if now we don't draft pandemic into force majeure clauses? Because you can't go and stand in court now and be like, well, this was an event that we could never have imagined, because now, I mean, we know that the last pandemic was 1918, I believe. And that was the Spanish flu. But now in this age, we've seen that occur and that happen. And so what does that look like for us? We know that judges, the more boilerplate a force majeure clause, the more it allows judges to place it in a context of specific analysis. Whereas if parties negotiate the force majeure clause more closely, what does that mean for them? Because a judge might say that because it's so heavily negotiated, then the parties knew exactly what they were talking about, and therefore they could say that, you've shown us what your thoughts were, and this was the intention, the full intention of the parties. So I think that maybe people will disagree with me, but I think that it'll be interesting to see how that goes down. And we know this causal link. When you look at force majeure, you know that force majeure cannot simply be declared because of economic hardship. That's just not something that you can say because it's harder and it's more expensive, I'm going to declare force majeure, because we find that in various places where they declared force majeure, like Talo in Kenya, it wasn't because of, even though the pandemic played a part, it wasn't solely because of that. It was because they were having environmental issues, they were having safety issues, and all of those things were playing into it. Supply chains have been affected, and that's what really happened in Ghana. And for us, the restrictions on travel, is that considered force majeure? So it'll be kind of interesting to see how judges kind of interpret that and how we move from that. But I think as lawyers more generally, are really looking at our force majeure clauses now and not treating them as simple boilerplate clauses that you kind of just throw into a contract,
Yeah. Dippo and Folarin, what have your challenges been, especially in this COVID area in regards to your contracts? Have you experienced, have you heard about what kind of challenges that parties have experienced in trying to actually challenge the force majeure clause, or trying to enforce it, or trying to ensure that the parties don't actually do that at all?
Well, this is Folarin. In my experience, no, the answer is no in terms of using force majeure as a clause to allow you to escape your obligation with the COVID when the COVID hit. And it just brings me back to the Ebola outbreak in the Congo, for instance, in DR. It'd be difficult for any company to, I think it'll be locked down for years in litigation if you use just the pandemic as an excuse to declare force majeure to relieve you of your obligation. If you look in the US, for instance, yes, the COVID caused a drop in the price of oil, but what a lot of the smaller companies that could not survive at the low oil price did is file bankruptcy, as opposed to going the force majeure route. And for me, it's a clear indication that force majeure route because of the pandemic, I mean, you'll be stuck in litigation and your creditors would not let you off the hook that easily, if you know what I mean. So for us personally, what has happened with us that directly impacted us with the COVID was we had a lot of clients come back to ask for deep cuts in our cost of providing services. And when they came back to ask for deep cuts, what was really challenging with that was it was a lot more expensive to continue to provide services with COVID, because a lot of things were shut down, logistics was a nightmare. I mean, cargo planes were the only ones that were busy and their prices went up. That was the interesting thing that happened during COVID because everybody ordered stuff online. So even for us that in the oil and gas that kind of you know, we in the oil and gas business, we tend to feel like we're special compared to everybody. You have your own, you have companies that are just specializing in logistics and everything. They were getting more action even from general logistics activity to where we then had to compete for space with consumer goods, which we didn't have to normally. So it was a question where it had to become a dialogue with the client. This is of what we're doing. We cannot give you a discount and it's costing us more, then you're going to put us out of business. So, I mean, and that conversation is still on. So for me, the impact, I would say, the use of force majeure, I have not seen personally.
Yeah, likewise, I haven't seen it used that much. I recognize what you're saying where, I mean, everyone understands practically what's happening. So there's a lot of negotiations and renegotiations, a lot of soft amendments to existing contracts, right? I think the positive thing about COVID-19 is that we all understand where we are, especially in the oil and gas industry, in the different countries, which tends to be more of a closed industry where you know who you're dealing with and you understand who your partners, your stakeholders, and your regulators are. You have discussions. I've been privy to have to some conversations. I can't really share much, but I do know we know. Okay, look, you're not able to meet this obligation, and this is why, and we understand why. So we also have to pass that back on. So we basically just align on how to serve the goal of getting energy to the customers. Yeah, so I haven't really. I'm sure there have been some extreme cases because there's always going to be that guy that doesn't understand, and there's always going to be a company that's about to go underwater and needs to do something to get levy. But I haven't had much experience with that, to be honest. From a lot of the dealings I've had speaking with vendors, speaking with contractors, and also as a supplier ourselves, we tend to figure it out outside the legal process.
That's great.
Just to add on that, from the LNG side of things, I think there has actually been one force majeure last year due to the pandemic that was involving BP and with the Tortue FLNG project within Senegal and Mauritania. So it wasn't that BP directly said they were going to cancel the project entirely, but they sort of gave a force majeure to say that the project was going to be delayed by a year. Even though the Tortue people back there in Senegal did try to push back, but I think by and large BP did did pull it through in pushing back their delay for over a year, because what they said was because it's an FLNG project, which is a floating liquefaction project as opposed to a land-based project, it requires a particular vessel. And because of this risk, and the vessel itself was being built in Singapore, and because of the restrictions imposed in Singapore, they didn't have enough people at the dockyards for a sizable number of months in 2020. Hence the force majeure to delay the project by a year. So there have been one or two instances like that, and I suppose within that reason, it's quite understandable if you can't build your ship if you can't build your ship for over a year. You know, that's quite understandable for you to say, you know what, I'm going to have to delay the project for a year. So, yeah.
Cases like that are, I mean, severe and rare. I mean, the floating LNG stuff is barely profitable, so I can understand.
I'm going to kind of piggyback what the men have been talking about in their experiences and say that, you know, for us as well here, it's been very interesting to kind of see the line between kind of producing assets and non-producing assets. We recognize that with producing assets, they were having conversations, but a lot of them were not trying to declare force majeure or suspend the project in any regard, right? Because on a daily basis, that costs more to them to do than to come and have a conversation and see how they can kind of, you know, renegotiate or talk to their suppliers to see how they can kind of keep things going. You found companies doing super innovative things, especially in Ghana, where they were actually like housing their employees that were on the rigs. They were making sure that people were getting quarantined for 2 weeks before they were going on rig, and when they came off, there was constant testing. And so they run a shift system. So you were seeing companies get really innovative. But I think that, I guess the men will talk about it or come up in this conversation, but I think it also opened up a conversation about like Africa and our kind of development of expertise in our own countries and what that means now, especially with the travel bans and so forth, and IOCs weren't being able to send people back and forth. What did that mean for kind of our local content plans and implementation of local content, but also just kind of seeing the innovation and seeing people kind of work through these things without trying to suspend. But these were mostly with producing assets versus non-producing, who found it a little easier to ask for suspensions because they kind of needed the extra time. So I think that a lot of times you kind of see where a company will fall and how they will deal with these suspensions and force majeure declarations during a period like this.
Okay, sounds interesting. Thank you so much for everybody's contribution. Now we're moving on to the next question. We note that oil and gas prices have been on the rise. Well, they are quite stable now, but they were on the rise, especially after the pandemic began to ease out in certain countries. We wanted to know, Folarin and Middy, is this rise going to continue after things continue to ease up? Or do you believe that this is as high as it will get? What do you think is going to be happening in the foreseeable future?
I guess I'll go first. The oil and gas prices, just like any other commodity, can be very speculative. But I think for oil and gas also, demand and supply has formed a big part of regulating the prices. If you look at markets that have really usable data, especially that's the West, the prices of oil goes up in the gas station when you're filling your cars in the summertime because people are moving around more. And in the winter, the prices of gas go up when people are trying to heat up their houses. So with that being said, now trying to say the price of oil as it was affected during COVID, it was a demand and supply issue. There were no planes in the sky, no cars on the road, nobody using this commodity, and yet the price went to at some point below zero. I think we've seen examples in our own experience and some of our operations where crude and we couldn't even get a buyer to take it on for free in the thick of the effect of COVID on the price of oil. And today the story is very different. So that COVID would exactly the effect of COVID. Once the world returns to normal, then the market forces will determine where oil and gas prices will be. Again, the regular market forces that have always governed that is my opinion, but not a direct effect of COVID.
Okay, Middy.
Yeah, and as anybody will tell you, predicting oil prices or commodity prices is a bit of a mux game. Before the pandemic in December 2019, oil was like $70. And right through the pandemic, it went down to 15, and then even to zero negative if you're looking at crude futures prices in the US. But by and large, like given the current prices we are right now of about in the mid 60s, I think those prices are quite sustainable as we come out of lockdowns, as the global vaccination rollout, not just in the US or here in the UK, but all across the world, there's going to be more demand. So that more pent-up demand that has been lost last year is definitely coming back to the market, and it's huge enough to support the prices. Because if you imagine that 60% of oil use actually comes from road transport, so your road, your cars, your trucks, and so now that all that is coming back, so there's enough pent-up demand to keep and support those prices. So as even though obviously there's a lot of talk about renewable, that is actually true. A lot of renewable energy is coming, whether it be wind, be solar, be the electric cars, but that's going to take time to feed through. Especially again, if you go back to the transportation sector, at the moment, only about 1% of cars are still electric, So if you bear that in mind, that 99% of cars still rely on internal combustion engines that basically require crude oil, that shows you for at least in the next 20, 30 years, there's still a sizable demand that's going to support those prices. Now, it might not be as huge and as high as it was before, like back in 2008, where it went up to $100, but there's still enough pent-up demand to support the prices. And actually, there's even an upside that the prices could even go higher, because actually what the oil industry is seeing now is now a phase of underinvestment. Because of the COVID pandemic, a lot of oil companies have had to cancel or suspend or delay their contracts outrightly. Even a lot of investing companies and investing banks at the moment are quite even not as bullish in supporting oil and gas projects because of the volatility we saw. They rather finance actually a lot more renewable projects whereby they actually can guarantee a price. So if the oil industry is now going through years of underinvestment, then that means in 2-3 years there may not be enough actual extra supply to meet up the extra demand that's going to come. So if anything, there's a bit of more upside in terms of prices going forward. But I would imagine it would be within this current range that we have of between 50 and 70. And that's just because if it goes anything below 50, we'll see OPEC cutting back prices. And if it goes above 70, we'll see a lot of the US producers, a lot of them that file for bankruptcy will come back into the market. But because at 50, 60, 65 is where a lot of shale production becomes more economic again.
Okay, thank you so much. Thank you for that contribution. That would bring me to my next question, which is about the coronavirus and its effect on the oil market and its contribution to the West's emphasis on shifting to renewable energy. But prior to me asking that, my question would be, what is the impact of the Paris Agreement on the oil and gas sector, and how relevant is it, or will it be, on African countries? And I'm going to be asking Dipo and Folarin that question. Dipo? Hello? Okay, Folarin, can you please help me with a contribution on that? We are discussing the Paris Agreement and its effect on, its possible effect on African countries.
Yeah, so the I think the big effect, if you look at the Paris Agreement, for instance, especially when it came into effect, where would you see effect first. Like Deepa mentioned, still only 1% of vehicles on the road are fully electric cars. And you have major cities in the world like London and Paris who have set a time. I believe some would happen very recently where a non-electric car, you can't take a combustion engine into places like central London and into Paris in the near future. I think Paris is even more, it's going to happen sooner than London. But in my opinion, that's not even going to scratch the surface, because if you look internally to Africa, what's going to happen is we're going to have another round of a dumping ground for all these combustion engines, and then the thirst for hydrocarbon in Africa is gonna rise, and the rest of the developed world. And the key for me when I think of these things is, at the end of the day, today in Africa, we're still well behind on providing electricity for everyone. We have the resources to provide the electricity in terms of gas. Gas is going to come into play, and gas will slowly replace a lot of the traditional use that we have for the combustion engines that we may have today in terms of providing power or even powering cars. We've seen a lot of developing nations, for instance, developed, I'll call it, in South Korea, for instance, they're now even moving away from CNG engines for their commercial mass transit buses. They're moving into fully electric engines. And now they're dumping those CNG engines into places like India, Brazil, and other developing nations. So those things at some point will start coming to Africa. They're sending out 5,000 to 10,000 in a year because they're getting rid of it completely. And when it comes here, we get to utilize our gas more. We can utilize gas to create electricity. So the impact of the Paris Agreement, I would say, yes, the reliable buyers like the US, the West, the Europe, and North America might disappear. And even without the Paris Agreement, even if they have the demand for hydrocarbons, now there are alternatives in the likes of Suriname and Guyana, where they can easily, it's shorter distance for them to transport crude oil from those places. So Africa would need to look internal to utilize our own resources to move forward. So I don't see, it's going to affect us, but it's not going to be a deal breaker. I don't believe so. It'd be a question of utilization by ourselves.
Thank you so much. I noticed that CNG is something that's growing in Ghana as well. So that's I think that's spot on. Depo, are you back at all? Can you?
I'm back. Dropped off for a couple minutes. Sorry.
Yeah, it's okay. The question was on the impact of the Paris Agreement on the oil and gas sector and how relevant it would be in impacting Ghana or impacting Africa at all.
Oh, yeah. So in terms of the Paris Agreement, I mean, we'll step back to understand what it means. So it's limiting the rise of global temperature by to 1.5 Celsius, I think, on an annual basis. And I think what that's done holistically is it's forced folks to change the way they think. I mean, I know my company has a document out there called the Sky Scenario. It's a credible means to meet that. And we've seen the impact, the portfolio impact that it's had. So in Nigeria per se, and some of the other countries in Africa, we're divesting traditional oil and gas assets, and people are going, oh, Shell's going to leave Africa. But then at the same time, our energy division is coming in, right? So we're changing what we're trying to do with the same intent to provide energy and now direct to the customer or the consumers. So the traditional, what we'll find in Africa is the traditional oil and gas play will have to be owned by us. Yeah, we'll have to step up if we want to continue the pace of development and the operations in what people term difficult to operate assets, while investment dollars probably go somewhere else because the oil and gas phase of the energy mix is coming to a slow end. I say slow end because it's going to take decades, but I do feel like we need to begin to educate ourselves, begin to build up our competence, not just to run assets, but if we're going to need traditional oil and gas plays to power our own energy and our own transition, then we're going to need to get into the exploration phase, which is something that we don't do. In most countries, I mean, in new entry countries like in Ghana, there's a lot of exploration, but I don't know if that's being led by Africans with African capital. Typically, what I find with exploration is that the skills come in from the Western world, and most of the funding comes in from the Western world. So we need to prepare ourselves for that, for when that tap closes.
Okay. Yeah, thank you for that contribution. It also brings me back to my the following question, which is how is the coronavirus and its effect on oil and gas contributing to shifting to renewable energy, and what does this mean for investments into new and ongoing projects in Africa? And if so, how is it affecting investment in ongoing projects in Africa? I'm going to direct this question to Ama and to, again, Dippo. Ama, please go ahead, please.
Completely admitting that I'm not an expert in this at all. I'm sure Dippo will have a lot more to say than me concerning this. But in my opinion, I don't think these things are linked. There's really no causal link between the coronavirus and kind of this shift into this conversation on renewable energy. I think the conversation on renewable energy started ages ago. We saw people like the African Development Bank kind of position Africa as one of, the key places where we could see this drive in renewables, and Africa could kind of take the charge, because there's no doubt the potential that Africa has. We have unlimited potential when it comes to renewables. We have abundant solar capacity, hydro, wind, geothermal, and these were the things we were using before we moved to oil or gas or anything that's more new. And we've seen kind of renewables being invested in heavily. We know that it's one of the Sustainable Development Goals. It's SDG 7, I believe, to provide affordable clean energy by 2030 and to have a net zero emissions by 2050, I believe. And so this is an important conversation that's happening. I don't think anybody can be left out of this conversation, whether Africa chooses to drive the conversation or not. But I think we are also seeing some pretty interesting things happening with regards to renewables and investment in renewables in Africa. I mean, we have the solar grid project in Morocco, which has started to produce energy and add to their grid since 2016. In a recent conversation with my friend, I heard about the Grand Inga project in the DRC, which I think is so fascinating, because this project apparently is supposed to, according to the AU website, supposed to provide over 40,000 megawatts of electricity. It's supposed to be bigger than the Three Gorges projects that we see in China, which is apparently the biggest in the world right now. And the AU claims that it is supposed to be to supplement regional power, but supposed to be the step towards providing Africa largely with modern sources of energy as Africa moves towards providing more affordable energy. There are so many places in Africa that have been kind of kept off our national grids in various countries. And I think renewable energy sources are such an important way to kind of send power to places that are aren't typically connected to our national grids and so forth. So I think the conversation is interesting. We can't be left out of the conversation, because as much as Africa still has a lot of resources in the ground with respect to oil, with respect to gas, I don't think climate change and these conversations are leaving anybody out. So I think it'll be kind of interesting, definitely interesting to see how this moves forward. But I cannot connect this with COVID in any way. I think that this is moving forward, whether pandemic came or not. And just like Dippo said, with respect to Shell divesting some of its assets, we've seen this happening. At ENI recently, also the conversation that they are divesting some of their African Middle East assets to fund some of their debt and move towards renewable energies and create an energy kind of sector or group to kind of invest in renewables. And so we'll see these things coming up. So I think we just have to watch out for it and kind of see how Africa places itself.
Thank you so much. That's interesting contributions. How about you, Dipper? What do you think?
Yeah, no, I think they're sort of kind of linked, but not in a direct way. So the energy transition, that's coming. That's been coming for a while, right? But I think COVID has accelerated that somewhat, and in two ways. So one, in terms of the technology play. I mean, the world shut down, yeah, but then operations kept going with people contributing remotely. So.
Yeah.
I mean, the simplest thing you can think about is just the Zoom, Skype, Teams technology that's carried us through. But when you start thinking more towards it, it's predictive maintenance, autonomous equipment, unmanned vehicles, unmanned rigs, and that change, that acceleration, then has you thinking about what's next, right? And when you now bring that home to the investors. So everyone was spooked when the price of oil dropped to zero. And folks start asking, look, we were going to pivot to an alternative fuel or a bunch of alternative fuels. Why do we continue funding an industry that seems to be dying? So I think, apologies, I have power outage every 5 minutes where I'm at, so it keeps going on and off. But yeah, back to what I was saying. I think what's been forced right now is the transition to come a little bit sooner because investment dollars are drying up. And also the regulatory authorities are protecting they're protecting their nations and their interests. Yeah. I think that's really forced a change. Yeah, so when I now think about what's happening in terms of the energy transition, I'll give another example. I'll speak about what I know. Back about 15, not even 15 years ago, 10 years ago, we had 20 refineries. We're less than 10 now, right? And a few are going to get converted into energy parks. So that plan, those plans got accelerated in COVID, during the COVID era. Right, so that's another strong linkage. So moving towards that, and when I think about investments in hydrogen, solar, and what people are doing, taking old chemical processing plants and turning them into solar farms, you can see all of that's moving. And another macro thing that needs to connect. Now with COVID, people working from home, yes. Cities are not going to be what they were. Yeah. I mean, if we do continue working remotely, and the incentive to go live in an overcrowded city, so you're 15, 20 minutes away from work, goes away. And if that pattern reverses, then there's more of an avenue to play in decentralizing the grid and introducing alternative fuels and alternative methods to get that to the customer. So all that kind of swings around and plays. So there is not a direct linkage, but there are a lot of things that were moving us towards energy transition. And I think COVID is just one of those things that accelerated it.
I agree that there's definitely some sort of acceleration. I also note that where there were transactions happening that were slow during, before the COVID pandemic, that were focused around renewable energy, especially in Africa. I'm not sure whether it's because people were at home, so therefore we had more disposable staff to work more on the legal matters, but I noted that there was an increase in vigor for more transactions surrounding renewable energy. So I definitely think that there's not a causal link of renewable energy and the pandemic, but I definitely think that there is a hastened emphasis, and there's an emphasis of renewable energy on after the pandemic. I'm wondering if anybody else has any comments on this really, to me, very interesting question. Maybe not so much. Midday, Folarin, anyone? Yorm?
I mean, just to add, talking about investments in the oil and gas industry, another thing COVID has done, especially how it affects Africa, and Dikpo has mentioned something a few times here, is I'd say even as recently as 5 years ago, there were specific funds added into fund managers from different parties that were specified to go after oil and gas investments in hydrocarbons. Another thing COVID has done is a lot of those funds have disappeared today. Obviously, because there's alternative now. Oil and gas is not what it used to be. 10 years ago, out of 10 largest companies in the world, more than half of it was oil and gas company. It is not one single oil and gas company out of the top 10 in today's world. Partly also thanks to COVID. It's interesting, a company like Zoom was on the verge of bankruptcy before COVID, and now it's one of the best investments anyone can have today in terms of their stocks. So when you look at all of that, now oil and gas is having to compete for money with industries they've never had to compete with. And the problem, what that would translate to in Africa is it becomes almost a last resort for a lot of this type of investment. And then some of what Deepa has spoken about now comes into play. Now, as young Africans, most of us on this call, how do we get involved? How do we raise money to go after these resources? Because the traditional way that money used to come in, that our governments generate revenue and what have you, is no longer there. Now, ExxonMobil is having to compete with Netflix and Apple. If you walk into New York, if ExxonMobil needs to raise $1 billion and Apple needed to raise $500 million, Apple will probably get $5 billion before ExxonMobil will get $500 million. And before Netflix will probably get money, or even Apple before ExxonMobil. And that's the reality of the new world. It's going to become more challenging, especially for Africa that depends a lot on foreign direct investment. I mean, these hydrocarbons account for a lot of our revenues for countries like Angola, Nigeria, Ghana, Congo, and even Equatorial Guinea. So when those investments are no longer there, the resources are still there. So how do we harness those resources for Africa to even consume our resources will probably be the next big challenge. And if you have that answer, you'll probably become the billionaire of that age when it comes from.
Okay.
I think that.
Okay, thank you. Thank you. That's a very interesting contribution. Folarin, do you have anything else as well to say?
No, that's it. Thanks.
Okay. Okay. Thank you. So then I'm moving on to the next question. The next question is on the learnings that the Western world can gain from Africa, and what learnings from that Africa can gain from the rest of the world. I'm going to direct this question to Middy and to Yorm. I'm going to begin with Yorm. What lessons do you think that parties have actually learned from, can learn from Africa? And on the other hand, what lessons can Africa learn from the rest of the world?
Okay, so I think we can make more use of data and technology in Africa. So I believe AI technology can play a key part in the transformation of the value chain of oil and gas industry, whereby complex data for oil and gas exploration and production is more accessible. We've seen this in Guyana, ExxonMobil using AI technology in Guyana, and then Shell as well. So that's why I think Africa can learn from the West. Thank you, Middy. What do you think?
I mean, what this pandemic has shown is that, I mean, the pandemic has been very hard for a lot of countries, but it's been doubly hard for countries that are very export reliant and don't have a local market to consume the commodities that they produce. So, and this applies a lot to a lot of like West African countries like Nigeria, Ghana, whereby most of your commodities are export led and there's no local market to consume the commodities you produce. So once the pandemic happened and all the export orders dried up, a lot of these countries were doubly hit because they had nowhere market to sell it to. So I think one thing that is definitely for sure that African countries have to learn is that we have to consume our own resources within the continent. Because, you know, apart from the fact that what the pandemic has happened is like, even with the energy transition coming, is the fact that even, I suppose the pandemic has sort of given us a window into what's going to happen in 10, 15 years down the line, when all these export orders dried up, and as companies move towards the energy transition and are not ever reliant on exports from our economies. So I think in a way, the COVID could have been a blessing in disguise to make the countries to be well prepared, for when this change actually happens 10, 15 years down the line, in the sense of being able to use your own local resources within your own country. Because when you use your own local resources within your own country, it's a multiplier effect. Like you use that to create jobs, you use that to power your industries, you use that to generate power, you use that to, and we have these resources in terms of the oil and gas. We could use the gas for fertilizers, we could use gas for power generation. And not only can we grow these economies within our own countries with the coming of the AfCFTA free trade zone across the continent, there's a whole range of supplying not just your own local economy, but the economy across the entire continent. So, if you look at it like a country like Nigeria that supplies gas on the West African gas pipeline to Benin and to Ghana, it shouldn't just be that. Nigeria should be supplying gas, to be powering like industries all the way far down in DRC, in Cameroon. That is what these economies have to start looking towards too. And that's how you create jobs, that's how you grow the economy. And on the back of that, you get energy independence. And from energy independence, you get financial independence. And what also that means is you have a better negotiating power to negotiate with the foreign direct investors when they come into your own country. Because at the moment, a lot of the countries are export-led. They have no local market to consume the resources that they have. So they basically have to take whatever conditions that the foreign investors come in order to be able to have revenues to sell their commodities. But when you already have an existing thriving industry locally, you have a better negotiating power for the foreign direct to come in to negotiate them at your own terms. So that's definitely one thing we can learn. And that also means that African economies have to diversify. You have to diversify your economy. You don't want to be commodity reliant, because as you see with the pandemic is, if your economy is tied to a particular commodity, whether it be coal, cocoa, what that means is your fortunes are tied to that price of that commodity. And so if for whatever reason, the prices goes down for whatever of the travails of the global market, then your economy shuts down. So it's very, very, very important you diversify your economy. I mean, when people look at Dubai today, nobody thinks of Dubai, UAE as an oil country. They think of it as tourism. That's how much far down the road that they've gone. So that is this should be the kind of lessons that African countries should be looking to take on board. And also, we should also bear in mind, for example, in Eastern Nigeria, there's a huge coal deposits, which is never going to be used again, because in terms of maximizing coal, that boat has sailed. So the other bit in terms of the energy transition is that oil and gas, the earlier you use your resources, the better. Because as we go down this transition, the pie for oil and gas within the energy mix is still going to be there, but it's narrowing and narrowing and narrowing. So you may end up if you don't use your resources, you may end up with a time whereby you're left with all these resources that you fail to utilize and maximize from. So there's no time for dilly-dallying. We have to learn to maximize our resources now to grow the economy. And how do you do that? You need to have sanctity of contracts. We need to have people need to be guaranteed their investments. They need to be sure that not that if a government changes, they lose their contracts. There has to be sanctity for contracts. Stuff like the petroleum industry bill in Nigeria. The quicker that gets passed, the better. That allows for the privatization of the state-owned oil company. The earlier that gets on, the better. That improves investor confidence. So yeah, those are my thoughts. Those are my thoughts. Yeah.
Okay.
Yes, go ahead.
If I may, just what we can learn in Africa is just the application of technology. I think that's a game changer because ultimately the business is to provide energy, yeah, but to do so without putting people's lives at risk and do so with the lowest possible operating cost that you have. And this is what technology gives us. I'm fortunate to cover 10 countries in my current role. And what I do is the application of digital technology to help improve asset management performance. And I see that in Africa, we can do a lot. We can learn a lot from not just the West, but from ourselves. I think embracing technology not as a gimmick, but as a means to a better outcome will help. It helped a lot of countries survive this this period, this downspell of COVID. I think if we look inwards and outwards, I'll give a few examples, right? I mean, we shouldn't be using notepads to write down metering figures, right? I mean, it seems like common sense that you should have that automated, and it seems like common sense that operators should walk around with iPads and iPhones as opposed to walking around with paper pens and pads. Regulation has changed, technology has changed. Most of these things are intrinsically safe. We need to have remote monitoring operations, set up centers. You can set up a center in Accra. You can set it up in Tunis or in Cairo to monitor operations wherever. Right? You not just monitor operations, but impact operations. That way you keep people away. I mean, simple things like tank cleaning. It would shock you to know how many people die every year from cleaning tanks. And these are things that you could have robots do. So the application of technology to keep people safe, also to drive down cost, optimize your supply chain. These are some of the lessons that we need to learn. Because the price of the oil is going to be the price of oil. I mean, geopolitics and other things will affect it. But maintaining a lean, mean operation that has minimal cost and keeps your people safe, because when people get hurt, that costs money as well. And if we take care of that end and learn how to do that by watching to see what goes on in South Africa, what goes on in Kenya, look at the tech coming out of Rwanda. If we take those lessons that are around us and outward, and we'll do a little bit better, I think.
Thank you.
I think
those are very good ideas. Ama, do you want to say?
Yeah, I wanted to add something. I think that an important lesson or thing that we see the national oil companies, and they kind of hived off into independent commercial IOCs themselves. And I think that, looking now, especially with building local content, is also looking at our national oil companies and invite towards becoming commercial entities ourselves or building operatorship capacity, because like the men on this call were saying, there's a lot of funding that is moving away. A lot of IOCs are divesting their assets and moving away. And so entering into JVs as national oil companies, actually learning and taking on understanding the skills and taking on the technology that we need to kind of continue even as things taper off will be very important. Building our national or local companies in the value chain is going to be so important. And that's why adhering to our local content regulations is so important. So companies shouldn't be coming in and fronting as, Ghanaian companies without taking on the technology transfer and the technical.
Okay, I think we may have lost Ama there. She froze, but I think that what she was discussing was on the transition of local content knowledge, or should I say foreign knowledge into local content knowledge. And I think that's something that we should definitely throw an emphasis on when we are considering about the lessons that we can learn from the Western world. And I think that would also be something that the Western world can also learn from us as well. I think we have, at least as I know, Ghana is making a lot of serious efforts, not just in the energy sector, but in all other sectors, to ensure a lot of local content emphasis. And that's something that can really cut across the knowledge building, the knowledge building in general, which will bring me to my last question for the evening, before we move to the questions from the audience, which are quite sophisticated in my opinion. I don't know how you're going to answer them. But the question that the general question that I wanted to discuss is, how is Ghana, that we know that Ghana and Nigeria and other Western countries, West African countries are investing in subsidizing electricity and subsidizing gasoline prices for the citizenry. In both cases, or across West Africa, it has not really improved the problems of supply and demand, neither has it really helped the macroeconomy. And so the question is, should these governments stop spending on subsidies, and should they instead privatize these industries and rather spend more on developing human capital? And what would this mean for the oil and gas sector in West Africa, and where these things generate money for the government, but also seem to cost money to the government? So the question I'm going to be directing this to is at Folarin and Dippo and whoever else feels that they can make a relevant commentary on this statement I've made.
Yes, so this is an interesting subject for me, and it's personal. And one of the reasons I say that is, for instance, Nigeria was one of, if not the first, one of the main entrants point into oil and gas and resource exploration in West Africa. And I think the first discovery was made in the late 40s. And even where we sit today in Nigeria, for instance, with all the local content laws and what have you, that seemingly people like to claim Nigeria has figured it out and everything, and they would like to copy it. One thing we've realized running a business here in Nigeria is you can't give what you don't have. Bill Gates was in Nigeria in 2018, and he met with the leadership and the government of Nigeria. And he did a joint review with them of their economic plan. And the reality is Nigeria has surpassed India in level of poverty in terms of the percentage of the population of people living in poverty. And what you see is we invest in things like subsidy and infrastructure without investing in human capital. If you enforce local content and you don't have the resources to fill those roles, we don't have the knowledge base because our people are not educated, then what you end up doing is you create a vacuum for a select few to benefit from those systems, and it does not necessarily benefit the wider populace. It doesn't have the effect that you've set it out to have. So, and this brings us to the approach that I think is really common in Africa is we treat symptoms of our issues as opposed to dealing with the root cause of some of these issues. I mean, you cannot, if a man has never seen, a man knows how to drive, but he's never seen a traffic light because he's been in the village driving a car all his life. So the first time he drives into a city, someone just put him in a car, taught him how to drive. He sees a traffic light. It can't correlate what to do and what not to do when the light changes. And that's what we see even in oil and gas. I mean, as a company, for us, one of the biggest challenges is recruiting good talent. And I would say majority of our staff, especially the high-performing ones, are people that are educated outside of Africa, mostly. They, either they're bachelors or they're masters, but they've spent some time outside of Africa. So they're bringing value that we don't see in people who have remained in Africa or they've worked and have experience outside of Africa. So when you look at a lot of these challenges, then where do you put funds? Does government need to leave businesses? An example that I like is what's happened in Ghana recently, where the president has said, oh, we're going to try to stop the export of cocoa. So if you want our cocoa, well, come down here, take that cocoa, make chocolate, and export the chocolate. In Nigeria, for instance, we produce crude that we sell to the rest of the world, but then the products, what they do with the crude, we need so badly, but we can't make because we have refineries that don't run. And now they're going to try to run the refinery, but they're going to go borrow more money from the West to fix the refinery. then you borrow money from the West, and then you bring a company from the West to fix that refinery. So now you've effectively double borrowed, because the money you've borrowed is going back to the West. And now you're still owing the West after giving the money you borrowed from them right back to them. And then, but the thing is, because we can't do these things locally. So I think the key thing here is to start treating the symptoms. Not saying this is just one of them. We have a lot of issues in that aspect. There needs to be a lot of focus in Africa on those things as important as developing human capital, be it education, be it healthcare. Those things need to be significantly improved, and we stop spending money on things like subsidy. And we still need infrastructure regardless. So it would be obscene to say stop spending money on infrastructure, but it's really clear a lot of money needs to go more into human capital than in the places that it goes to today.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, go on, Dippo.
No, very briefly, I'll say Falari hit the nail on the head. The subsidy stuff needs to stop. You put an end to it. Because it makes no sense, and it's bad practice, right? So we produce oil, right? We send it off somewhere, right? And we bring it back as a refined product, and then we subsidize that entire process with loans, spending money that the government doesn't have, right? At the detriment of education, healthcare, security, etc. Right? And it's weird because not only we have the supply in abundance, everything, I mean, in Africa. And then we also have the demand in abundance, right? I mean, speaking to Nigeria, you hear when you look at every pitch deck for every startup, it starts off with 200 million people in Nigeria from this perspective. So that's an awful lot of demand to match the supply that we have. However, we go about it in a manner that is non-productive, non-economical, and is done at the detriment of everything else. Right? So my views on subsidy is that it's really non-value adding. Well, it adds value to maybe 50 to 100 people who are involved in the process. But I'll stop there before I get shot.
Exactly. Olamide, do you have any comments as well?
Yeah, just one thing to add. I mean, it's like, yeah, the subsidy, in any well-functioning society shouldn't really exist, because if the refineries were working, you would just take the refinery straight from the crude goes into the refineries, and there'll be no need for imports. It's because the refineries are not working, and there's this like massive, almost like a kind of Ponzi scheme, whereby just money is being lost on a daily basis. If the refineries were working, Nigerian refineries are probably like the most refined refineries in human history. They've undergone turnaround maintenance for times and times and times. Yeah. If the refineries were working, for example, there's nothing stopping Lagos from being like a transport hub for flights across Africa. There's nothing stopping Lagos from being like a transport hub for, just like Dubai is. At the moment, most flights that go through the continent, again, back to the fact that of how the African economies have to use their resources locally and increase trade. At the moment, proponents of lack of trade is the fact that of the poor connectivity between the countries on the continent. Most flights, from Nigeria to Kenya or to South Africa have to be rerouted through Dubai. That's quite, the fact that that's still happening in 2021 is quite a bit abnormal, given Nigeria's on Lagos position direct next to the oil fields. Just like Bavia in Utro, there's one of the reasons the UK government, I think, did not shut down the economy did not shut down the airports, was because Utro is the kind of export, was a kind of like a flight of connecting flights from around the world. And if Utro is directly linked to a refinery, there's nothing stopping Lagos from being that, or whereby there's a direct supply from one of the refineries, whether that be Warri or Port Harcourt, direct supply of kerosene or jet fuel into Lagos and being a kind of transport all across the continent. But we can only have that if the refineries are working, So the fact that once the refineries work, once we don't have subsidy, you don't only solve the subsidy problem, but there's a whole lot of other advantages you can begin to take off if we're able to end this sort of subsidy Ponzi scheme mentality.
Ponzi scheme. Okay, thank you so much for that comment. I agree. I think subsidizing, but I do think that Ghana has moved away from subsidizing our electricity nonetheless. But I think that's a smarter move to move away from subsidizing. As you are saying, it costs the country more to take out the loans in order to subsidize, which we in turn we have to end up paying back, than to just simply cut off the subsidizing and seeing how we can move forward to empower our nation so that they can actually pay for their bills for themselves in the long term. Ama, do you have any comments on that at all? No, none.
No, I don't.
No. Okay, we will be moving to the favorite part of my of this topic or this discussion. The next question is, how did all of you get into the industry, and what advice would you give to anyone trying to get into the industry? I'm going to start this question by targeting again Ama. How did you start this off? What got into oil and gas in the first place, and how did you end up in GMPC? Was it a smart decision, or it was just something that you just fell into? Please tell us more.
So, like I said, don't have kind of a master's in oil and gas, didn't specialize at all, kind of did general law. And I will say this, that you shouldn't, if this is an industry that you want to be in, you shouldn't be afraid to start small. I mean, I came into GMPC not as an employee, but as an intern. And I think that I kind of grew from that role and grew upwards. And so don't be afraid to start small. Don't be afraid to enter the industry as an intern or to use your network to go to places, to get a foot into places that you want to be in. And once you get a foot in, I think that it is important for you to kind of read around and pay attention to what's going on with around you. The industry is changing really quickly. I think that even in the 5 years that I've been in the industry and in Ghana, there's so much that has changed. The way the industry is structured, the things that are coming up, the move from more petroleum agreements to focusing on gas because of our gas find with OCTP. But you should be open to kind of reading and paying attention and utilizing your network and not being afraid to start small. So that's what I have to say. So that's how I kind of got in. I came in as an intern and kind of grew from there.
I agree on that. I also had to take a big step and change my career growth, should I say. And when I was moving, I was qualified in Ghana, and I started off as an intern in a big international law firm. And I really think that even though it was a complete downgrade from an associate to an intern in in a huge international law firm, it really changed my perspective of things. It gave me so much access, and it gave me so much more experience than if I stayed on the trajectory that I was then. So I definitely agree that taking a step that you don't necessarily think is the best move in the certain trajectory that you are isn't necessarily a bad thing if it's going to lead to something better in the future. So I definitely agree that don't be afraid to take steps. Don't be afraid to make the move. Don't be afraid to make that career change. And the next person I'm going to be asking about this is Yorm, because I know that you also made a career change to become a legal professor. So how did you get into the industry? And also, what advice would you give to people who are trying to enter into the sector?
Okay, thank you, Lucy. I've always wanted to be in the industry, mostly because my parents work in the downstream sector. So I've always had it in mind. So I literally fell into it. I'll say it's a calling. I didn't know which part of the sector I wanted to work in, actually, but I also wanted to be a lawyer as well. So then when I went to the third year in uni, we're introduced to this course, energy law. And that's what sparked my interest. And I knew I could be an energy lawyer. And then after my LLB, I pursued my LLM in oil and gas law. And then from there, I've been practicing as an energy lawyer, mostly specializing in oil and gas litigation and arbitration. And then now I've left the industry, I teach law. So I'm no longer an industry person, but now I'm in academia. And I'd like to say anyone who wants to join the industry, all you have to do is to make sure you read wide and keep up. As Amma said, just keep up because it's fast paced and it's always changing. There's always something new. And you should always be ready for a challenge because this industry can be quite challenging.
Yeah, I agree on that. It's a very challenging industry and very competitive. So you need to definitely keep ahead of the times. Dippo, how did you get into the industry yourself? And also, what would you also tell people who are trying to get into it themselves?
I got into the industry from the start. So I've always
Hello? I think we've lost Dippo. So I would be asking the same question to Folarin.
Well, I guess I got into the industry. I mean, going by my background in marine engineering, and also it was all around and everywhere growing up in Nigeria. The thing to do was to work in oil and gas. So I kind of told that line as things evolved. And one thing that I always knew I wanted to come back and be an active participant in the industry in Nigeria specifically. So, but one thing that was important to me was after going to school in Texas, I wanted to get enough experience which is another oil and gas hub. As a matter of fact, some people call it using the oil and gas capital of the world. And I got those experiences working there before I came back to Nigeria and founded Ripen Marine. So what I would say, however, is if you're thinking of coming in the industry now, with a lot of the conversation that has happened tonight, is a fast evolving and changing industry. It's an industry that's set in its ways. Oil and gas is an extremely conservative industry. So new things are not they don't welcome new ideas very easily. However, that's part of what's plaguing the industry, to where it's being played out in today's world, because if you resist change, you're going to be left behind. So there's a lot of opportunities in terms of bringing technology into oil and gas. So if you're thinking of coming into oil and gas now, think of technology, think of improvement, think green, and there's a lot of room, especially in Africa. And I'll steal a leaf from Deep is also one of the big hit things that I think is coming to this industry, especially in Africa, is we will need to figure out new ways to raise funds to explore these resources in Africa, because where the funding used to come from is going to dry up eventually with the rate at which things are going.
I agree. Thank you for that. I would also say that the robotics idea from Dippo wasn't a bad idea at all. So if anybody wants to get into it. Middy, how did you get into the industry? What lessons would you give to other people, and what would you give as advice?
Okay, cool. I mean, it kind of, for me, just it kind of happened. It was unexpected. So my father is a doctor. So all through growing up, I'd always wanted to be like a doctor, like my father. And then as I was approaching uni, writing my leaving exams, I sort of kind of have an epiphany, even though I didn't know what, I'm sure at the time I didn't know what an epiphany was, but I just knew I didn't want to be a doctor. So it's like, okay, so what am I going to do now? What am I not going to do in uni? I didn't know. So I was like, okay. And I was like, I remember just going through like the courses the unis were offering. And then I saw geology, and the requirements they required was chemistry, biology, and geography, which I was okay at those. I was like, okay, sounds like a good course. Then I remember like my neighbor got a job with an oil company, and he came back home so rich. I was like, okay, there's a lot of money there, and geography and chemistry, I'm good at it. So that's how I just took geology in Ife. And so I did geology. And then when I finished, back then I was in Nigeria, only the banks were recruiting. So I ended up working for a bank. But fortunately enough for me, the bank was in Abuja, and they were managing the funds of the NNPC, which is the Nigerian National Petroleum Corporation. So fortunately for me, I got posted to that branch, and I got exposed to the commercial side of oil and gas. So looking at like their remittances, looking at their revenue accounts. And that then informed my master's degree to do oil and gas management as opposed to like petroleum engineering or petroleum geophysics. So, and that's how I kind of got into the industry from when I finished my master's, and then I got a job with IHS Markit, and then to my current company now at ICIS, which I've been with for the last 7 years. In terms of advice, what I would definitely say is you need to have a wide network within the industry. Not all job applications are going to come from you applying via a desktop. A lot of job positions are going to come through your networks, through recommendations. Increase your networks. Join industry groups like the Energy Institute, Society of Petroleum Engineers. Those industry groups actually come very handy. They organize conferences, they do trainings. So actually, when you're trying to get your foot in the door, you might be able to get 1 or 2 trainings for free. You might be able to be at events whereby you could meet senior leaders within the industry that could get you recommended. I would also say take internships. Internships are very good, even though they might be unpaid. But in terms of your CV, they look very good because it's always a catch-22 for people starting out in the industry because they always ask for experience. And so, if no one gives you an experience, then you're never going to get a job. So, but if you do internships, they're actually very good for your CV in that, like, you do have some sort of experience. And it's also a bit of like a foot into the door because a lot of times where people do intern, when they do graduate, some of those companies ask them to come back to work for them. I also say it's like a lot of people think the oil and gas in terms of it's only geologists, it's only engineers, but it's actually a wide range of people. It's everything from finance, accountants, lawyers, data analytics, cloud computing. So it's a whole range of people that if it doesn't matter your background, there's a whole lot of space within the oil and gas industry for you. And I will also say especially when you start getting towards your master's or your final year, try to take courses towards try to tailor your courses you're taking towards potential job. I know doing in undergrad and in undergrad, probably more in masters, you're able to think like that. But as you approach your final year, don't just do courses for the sake of doing courses. Try to do courses with an idea of what kind of jobs you're going to apply for. That definitely helps. So it helped in my instance when I was going to get my current job about 7 years ago because I just finished. It held the fact that my dissertation was on floating LNG, even though at the time I had no experience in LNG yet. So those will be my few nugget points.
Okay, thank you. Dippo, you're back online, so please tell us what you were unable to do.
Okay.
Yeah. Oh.
All right, so let me go again. All right, so I started off very early. I always loved the oil and gas industry, living in Lagos. So I basically went to college for this. My bachelor's at the University of Oklahoma was in petroleum engineering, my master's as well. And straight out of school, I got into the industry. I was lucky to have the opportunity to work in a lot of different companies and a lot of different aspects of the industry to see. I think it's great. I would strongly encourage anyone who wants to sign up to do so. But when you do so, recognize that you're no longer joining the oil and gas industry or an oil and gas company per se. You're joining an energy company because we're looking at the traditional plays, oil and gas, looking at all the alternative fuels. We've talked about them: hydrogen, solar, wind, what have you. And that's the mission. I was saying the other day that if you look at some of the scenario planning, oil and gas demand will go up to 2050 and keep growing, then flatten out there, then start to decline in 2070. So there's still a lot of time for folks to get involved. And You'll see a lot of the talk about, fossil fuels utilization going down, but there's also still the plastics, even though it's not great for the environment. But the economic muscle behind plastics is still there. So I would say get in. It's one industry where, to be honest, everyone can play in. We have lawyers. I mean, you have accountants, finance folks. You have security professionals. You have all the different types of engineers. You have data scientists, the digital technologists. You have everything. So there's room for everyone to play in. What's not so great anymore is pre-COVID. I mean, you would have the opportunity to work almost anywhere, but I think that's changing a little bit now, and thanks to technology, and we're going to have to do a lot of things remotely. Well, all in all, I mean, I would encourage, and I think it was Illuminated that mentioned something great. It's more of a closed off industry, so you have to rely on networks. I'm part of the Society of Petroleum Engineers, and I know being a part of that society has helped me greatly in my career, because I've been able to meet a lot of people who influenced my career, and I hope I've met a lot of people who have influenced their career. So join some of these networking, some of these associations, build your network, because it's closed off, and it's not the tech industry, right? New ideas come once every 4 years. So yeah, just embrace it, and hey, let me know how I can help. Feel free to ping me offline.
Oh, okay, thank you so much. Are there any more comments from anyone else? Any other pieces of nuggets of advice? Okay, then we have a few questions. I've answered some of them on the chat, and I will ask a few more here. We don't have much time left on our hands, so I will be really brief with that. The first question is, what reconversion technologies are being seen in Africa that is helping scale renewables? And what sector in Africa is poised to see the fastest growth? Example, in industry, mobility. I'm not sure whether it's in reference to the oil and gas or energy industry or just in general, but I will relate it, since this is an energy topic, to the energy sector. And so the first question I asked again is, what reconversion technologies are being seen in Africa that is helping scale renewables? I'm going to give that question to technical guys. So that would be, let me look at y'all CVs. That would be to Dippo, Middy, and Folarin. In fact, to all three of you boys. Can any of you answer those questions? That question. Dippo?
If I hear correctly, what sector would see in West Africa would see, I think, renewable energy first? And my easy answer to that is, first, I think for Africa, renewable energy is gas. For now, for the nearest future, it's going to be gas. And that sector would be the power and the transportation sector, is where gas, I mean, it's lesser combustion than the alternative of using fuel, especially in the transport sector. By the time you start seeing more CNG facilities going around, our hydrothermal systems are not, I mean, they've not been utilized well. An example is, for instance, on the river Benue, there's a dam in Cameroon that is used for hydroelectricity. And the effect of that is, when they open up, when the banks are full and they open it up, it causes a lot of flooding in an area of Nigeria known as the Gongola Basin, across a few states in Nigeria. And it's been a major talking point of disputes between Nigeria and the Cameroonian government. So it's something that I'm sure at some point Nigeria would try to convince Cameroon to buy some of our gas, like Ghana and some West African countries are. So I think gas would definitely be coming into play in the transport and power sector in Africa, like we know it, as the closest to renewable. When batteries, hydrogen, and solar will come in, I still see that being far out.
Okay, thank you. Do you have any other comments, Midday and Dippo?
Yeah, I would have to agree with Falari that natural gas is the way. I mean, you wouldn't per se really term it as renewable, but it's a much cleaner fuel that you can do a whole lot with. I mean, if you were to look to see what the challenges are in a lot of sub-Saharan African states, it would be access to electricity and power. I know we have a commitment in my company to provide access to energy to 100 million people who don't already have it. And the primary driving force behind that will be gas. Talk about hydrogen. We can't afford it. We're not there yet. Talk about nuclear. I don't think the world will let us get that. Solar is emerging as well, but solar will be something that has to grow organically and has to be led by small and medium-sized enterprise, and it's going to take a while to scale up. But I do think that comes a distant third behind natural gas. I'm thinking about the other sources. Hydroelectric has had its day, but Falari already mentioned a lot of the issues there. And yeah, I'm struggling to think of any other alternative. Geothermal, perhaps that's not tapped. I think that requires a little bit of capex that you probably struggle to get large scale in terms of investments. So natural gas is there. And why natural gas is actually good is, I mean, because we've already drilled a whole bunch of oil wells that we have that can be repurposed either by recompletion or sidetracks to access gas. There are a lot of networks already laid in terms of the midstream. I think that requires just a little bit of additional investment, but it's a sustainable one, and I think it's the near-term future, also because of the abundance as well.
Okay, thank you so much. I think that we've answered quite a few questions here. I've also answered a few of the other questions that I haven't posed to you into the chat. So everybody who has any other queries can see some questions being answered there. I think that unless anybody has any other questions, I think that we've had quite a successful evening. We've just discussed a lot, and I feel that it was quite informative. At least it was quite informative for me, who's also quite new in this industry. I hope that you guys learned something from this, and I hope that you will come back to us when we have a new another session on a different topic entirely. Nonetheless, thank you everyone. Thank you so much for attending. Thank you so much, all my panelists that came in today. I really appreciate the effort and the time that you put into answering these questions, attending all the other meetings prior to this one to answer any other further questions. I'm getting good commentary so far that it was an excellent conversation and it was very informative, and all of you seem quite knowledgeable in your fields. So I thank you so much. And on this note, I think that we are done for the evening. Have a lovely evening and have an enjoyable week. Take care, everyone.